Chapter 2 covers the logic of the Constitution and the process of the formation of the U.S. Constitution and its structure. I borrow a little bit from a lecture that I used to give called Neither Gods Nor Devils, with the idea being that too much is made recently of whether the people who are the founders and framers in the United States are these perfect individuals who came down from on high with special knowledge to create the perfect land and culture, versus if that's not true, are they actually evil people? And I've often made the argument that they were just people of their time, and perhaps they were somewhat more intelligent than the typical person that you might expect in 18th century America, and they were certainly wealthier, but that doesn't necessarily make them either good or evil. We only know in retrospect the things that they did that were strong versus the things that they did that were, unfortunate. So what we're going to do as we look at this is we're going to try to look at the system of government they created, the process by which it occurred, and it will help inform us in our understanding of the United States in the years since. So who were these founders? And I think one of the mistakes we often make is we either know of 2 or 3 or 4 of these people, and we make generalizations of them all based on those 2, 3, or 4 people. And also, another mistake we make is that we assume they were all the same. When in reality, the people who founded the United States had many competing interests, and much as you would expect somebody from Massachusetts, someone from Georgia, from California, and somebody from, let's say, Arizona, to have very different ideas about what the United States should be and how the government should act to help and protect its people. Today, surprisingly, you have the same difference back then. Regional differences were actually more acute then. It's much easier for you, perhaps not on this particular day, but let's say on a typical day in 21st century America, to wake up in the morning and decide that you're going to finish the day in California, than it would have been to do this, to say that I'm going to finish the week in Maine, having awakened in Cobb County, Georgia, back at the beginning of the 19th century. In fact, it may well have been impossible to get from North Georgia to Maine in 1 week back then. What we see people, they hike the Appalachian Trail today, and they have to start in the spring because by the time winter rolls around in Maine, or by the time the heat of summer rolls around in Georgia, depending on the direction they're going, they need to be a certain length of the way, right? It's very difficult, right? So maybe you ride horseback up to Washington and then north, but it probably would have been much easier if you lived in Savannah to get to New York City than it would be if you lived in Atlanta, Georgia to get to Savannah at the time. Now, because of that, there were even differences in language patterns and things in America in the 18th century. So regional differences were important. Economic differences. Now, some of this is regional too, right? Parts of the country where it's very easy to grow foodstuffs versus parts of the country where it's very difficult. Parts of the country that were prone to large-scale agriculture versus parts of the country that were better suited for small craftsmen to trade goods, and it'd be easier to import the food you were eating, or to be a fisherman than to grow agricultural goods. Religious differences, and when we consider that almost everybody who lived in the United States in 1800 was a Protestant Christian, it's easy to forget the very huge differences between different denominations of Protestant denominations at the time. The conflicts, there were wars, right, between Episcopalians and Presbyterians in Scotland, and with separatists and your more reform elements in Protestant Christianity in England at the time. Many of these issues are very surprising to people today. For instance, the huge conflicts that Methodists and Episcopalians had with Baptists in Virginia in the 18th century. And remember, there had been a revolution in England less than 100 years before, and I don't think that they wanted to have a religious war in the United States. There were educational differences. We often talk about people like Benjamin Franklin who were self-taught, but there were also people amongst the founders who were very educated, who had attended college at the time when there were only a couple colleges in all of North America. And of course, one thing I should point out is that when I say founders, I'm usually talking about the Continental Congress and the people who declared independence, and we usually talk about framers when we're referring to the people who wrote the Constitution. Well, anyway, lots of ideas here, and remember that there isn't widespread understanding and support. The U.S. Constitution is more popular today, at least conceptually, than it was at the time, because at the time it was a new idea that was being debated. So if it's 1787 and you're a framer of the Constitution, or a would-be framer of the Constitution, right? They haven't done it yet. What are your big worries? What are your concerns? And the text goes into more detail about this, but some of the ideas that you're worried about is anarchy, a complete collapse of government. Since we assume in this class that government does accomplish certain things, your trash gets picked up and such. That particularly if you're a property owner, you are not going to be an advocate of anarchy. A dissolution, or the idea that the United States would fall apart into individual states or collections of states. Already by 1787, some of the states were instituting trade tariffs against each other. They wanted to make sure that, at a very minimum, that the states were able to engage in free trade with other states. National security, internally the fear of a revolution against state governments, against certain state governments, but externally as well. If you're a divided country that has very little in the way of a central government, there's many huge, powerful countries in the world, France and Spain and the British, that have colonized much of the world, and you don't want to be a colony. You've just broken free. Of course, economic depression. We worry about that to this day, right? Economic calamity is perhaps something that we hope government can help us with. And of course, these regional differences we talked about before. And the way I put this in here, we shouldn't forget that there's an underlying component of slavery in these regional differences. When we talk about slavery and we wonder, well, which are the big states? And then we say, well, do we count both the people who have political power in the state, and do we count the people who don't? Taxes and tariffs. If the central government is going to be taxing a state, should they tax the state based on um, based on its wealth that it might have in terms of slaves? Right? It's one of those big questions of philosophy for the North, right? Is it right to ask Southern states to pay um, a head tax or a tax on population on people who aren't really part of the population or aren't part of the political community? And of course, economic development. Already at this time, I was telling you how difficult it was to travel from Georgia down to, from Atlanta down to Savannah to get on a boat. And so if you lived in Savannah, you were much closer to the rest of the world than even somebody in Atlanta would be to Savannah. If you wanted to bring something like a piano, you could bring a piano across the Atlantic Ocean for less money than you could bring a piano from Savannah up the mountains on in a horse-drawn carriage or horse-drawn cart. But also, the southern states differed from the northern states. The northern states wanted very much to open up the Midwest and get those farms to be able to bring their goods to market. Whereas in the southern states, there was much more of a self-contained to each plantation economic system that was more likely to do its trade internationally. Once you left the plantation, the next likely trading partner was much more likely to be somebody overseas, whereas in the North, the next likely trading partner was probably somebody in a place like Boston or New York or Baltimore. So what were the goals of the Constitutional Convention? Well, one goal, and they seem to be counter goals, right? One goal was to have a national government strong enough to protect the vital interests of the people the economic interests of the country, the religious interests of the country, the political interests of the country. While at the same time, to be too weak to threaten the interests of the powerful, right? So the powerful need protections of property rights, and they need protections of economic rights, and they need protections of social understanding. But the government also has to be too weak to upset those property rights and religious rights and political rights and traditional power. And so how do you capture that midpoint? Well, that was the challenge of the convention. And remember always, we're discussing a smaller, weaker country. We're that 13-star country and not the 320 million person country that we live in today. So the first big conflict was over representation. If you're going to form a democratic or a Republican form of government, then what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to come up with a lawmaking body, a legislature, that in some meaningful way represents the democratic interests of the society. What is the national interest? What is the common interest? Well, your perception of what the common interest is often determined by who you are and where you live. The first state to act came up with the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan, often associated with James Madison. Remember, there was this kind of way of thinking back then that if you are a powerful person, that you don't want to get down into the muck and mire. So if you're, Edmund Randolph or you're George Washington and you're a leader in society, you're not the one who's going to go and make the argument on the floor of the convention in favor of something. And so Madison's like, yeah, okay. And so anyway, the Virginia Plan, or the Big State Plan, suggests that we're going to create a national government whose primary power is vested in a Congress where the size of a state's representation is going to be determined by its population. The Virginia Plan called for a bicameral legislature, which means two chambers or two houses of the Congress. The lower house would be based on population and be directly elected by the citizens. Well, this, of course, would make Virginia extremely powerful. Remember, Virginia then was the current state of Virginia, the current state of West Virginia, and the current state of Kentucky. It was the largest state. Today, this would be the plan that California suggested. The upper house wouldn't be as strong as the lower house. The upper house would be based on population, but would be appointed by members of the lower house. The idea by people like Alexander Hamilton would be that this would be a lifetime appointment for people who were retired political figures, and they would give advice to the lower house, but the lower house would make all of the important decisions. And the new thing, the thing that everybody could agree on, is that this legislature, unlike the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, would have the power to lay taxes, which is to assign a tax burden, and would have the power to collect taxes, which is to say actually get the money. Now, competing against the Virginia Plan was the New Jersey, or the small state plan. The New Jersey Plan said, well, we're not completely dissatisfied with the Articles of Confederation, and we want the central government to remain weak when compared to the states. And we feel that each state should be equally represented. So we would have a unicameral, or one chamber Congress, and each state would have equal representation. Now, there was some understanding that maybe the big states would have more representatives, but that that they would all just get one vote. And the New Jersey Plan said, well, one problem we have is that we shouldn't just have only unanimous decisions, right? A majority, they were fine with majority rule, but they thought that all states should be equally represented. It was really just a plan to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. And remember, when the Constitutional Convention was called, that was all that their mandate suggested, was that they were going to propose a new and stronger Articles of Confederation, with the main difference being that there would be a power to lay and collect taxes, just like in the Virginia Plan. Well, these two competing plans almost caused the convention to fall apart. Fortunately, one of the great heroes that we seldom talk about, Oliver Ellsworth, helped come up and draft a new plan, which is at the time was called the Connecticut Compromise. Sometimes we call it the Great Compromise today. And it becomes the heart of Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. And a lot of it could be understood as the Virginia Plan with the New Jersey Plan grafted onto it. They said there would be a bicameral legislature, but rather than having a weak upper branch, the upper chamber, the upper house, which came to be called the Senate, would actually be more powerful than the lower house or the House of Representatives. The lower house would be based on population, and its primary power would stem from the ability to collect taxes. All tax bills were to begin in the House of Representatives. Now, they would have to be passed also in the Senate, but they were to begin in the House of Representatives. This is very similar to a British theory of government that says that whereas the king could carry out most responsibilities of government, the one thing that he couldn't do without the permission of Parliament was to raise taxes. So this is comparable to that. The upper house was based on equal representation, as the New Jersey plan called for, but it said that each state would have 2 representatives and that those representatives would vote individually. They'd be elected by the state legislatures, and it would be more powerful because the Senate would be the body that would approve all presidential nominations. Now, what this gives is that for most lawmaking, there is a directly elected House of Representatives that has a say. However, it remains some elements of the Articles of Confederation by saying that most of the executive branch will remain a body that has to be approved by the states. And at the time, they thought that this was a pretty good finesse of the differences between the small and the big states. That the big states would get the laws they wanted, while the small states would still just be protected from having too much of their authority encroached upon. A much more difficult problem was what to do with the large slave population in terms of representation in Congress. Now remember, we are not talking about empowering slaves to vote. I used to give open book, open note, but short essay answers, quizzes and exams. And one of the exam questions I would always ask is describe the 3/5 compromise. And time and again, I'd have students who said that the 3/5 compromise would say that African Americans would only get 3/5 of the vote that white people would have. And that's not true at all. African Americans had no vote. In fact, the 3/5 compromise empowered slave owners by making them, allowing them to be represented 3/5 more for each of the slaves that they owned. This made slave owners powerful. It didn't do anything for slaves themselves. In the South, with many slaves, wanted to count slaves for representation, but not for taxes. And this would have made the Southern states much larger in terms of representation in the House of Representatives than the Northern states. Now, the Northern states, who had few or no slaves, only wanted to count the slaves for taxation, but not for representation. And this would have made the Northern states, who had many more free citizens, much larger than the Southern states. And so, your question is, well, what is the best outcome? And, there's a temptation to say, well, you certainly don't want to say that slaves are of less value as human beings. But at the same time, empowering the people who are oppressing slaves by giving them extra votes in Congress would cause slavery to be more powerful. And so what the framers did, the way the framers finessed this, was they actually looked at the size of the various states that were on either side of this issue, and they said, what would cause the southern states and the northern states to have equal representation in the House of Representatives. And if you multiplied the number of slaves by 3/5, you would actually cause the northern states and the southern states to have roughly equal populations. So there was no great moral or philosophical reason for the 3/5 compromise, other than to just say each side is equally powerful. Now, the element for taxation doesn't really have much of an effect because they end up not instituting a poll tax or a tax on the number of people in a state. And the Southerners decided that they didn't want to have taxation at all. And the primary way that they funded the government, which remember was much smaller at the time, was through tariffs or taxation on imports. So anyway, the 3/5 compromise is always a very controversial topic in American history, but it didn't really have the philosophical underpinnings that people seem to give it today. It was just very cold, pragmatic understanding of let's make the North and the South equally powerful. The next section of the chapter actually starts to talk about the different elements of the Constitution and what is in the Constitution. So Article 1 created the legislative branch. And so, when we talk about the oldest branch of government, we mean by however much time it took to print Article 1 before you get to Article 2. Article 1 talks about the qualifications, the rules for election, how you become a member of the House and the Senate. Then it talks about the powers of the House and the Senate. Largely, this is Article 1, Section 8, which lists all of the powers of Congress, at least what we call the enumerated powers, which is to say actually spelled out. Now, there is something called the implied powers, or the powers that make sense given what we say Congress can do. And the so-called necessary and proper clause is an important element of this. The necessary and proper clause says that Congress can pass laws that are necessary and proper to carry out their other responsibilities. So from that we say, well, it follows that if government can regulate commerce, that they can regulate the economy generally. If they can coin money, then that means that they can appoint somebody to be responsible for coining money, and so on. And then the last sections of Article 1 limit the powers of Congress and of the states in terms of lawmaking. So Article 2 deals with the executive branch. It actually only mentions two jobs, the president and the vice president. Now, initially, the Electoral College chose the vice president and the president on the same ballot. Each elector would get to vote twice. They picked one person who had to be from some state other than their own, and then they could vote for anybody else that they wanted to, including somebody from their own home state. Well, it didn't take long for that system to fall apart. It largely did because of the creation of political parties. Political parties would have two candidates, and then they'd decide which one should be president and which one should be vice president. Well, in the 1796 election, we actually had a president elected from one party and a vice president elected from a different party, all because the vice president the vice president, who was Thomas Jefferson, was elected vice president because too many people from his party thought that they shouldn't vote for him for president, that they should vote for his vice presidential candidate instead. In 1800, Jefferson and his allies decided that each of them would vote for Thomas Jefferson and for Aaron Burr. They win, but then it's a tie. Well, Aaron Burr was supposed to drop out and say, no, that's okay. I won't be president. I'll be vice president. Instead, he decided, well, this is my chance to become president. He thought he had friends amongst the Federalists who would help him get elected president in Congress. And it was a big struggle. Jefferson wasn't very popular with the Federalists, and Burr was maybe somebody they thought they could work with. But eventually, eventually Jefferson was elected, and immediately they said, we have to change this. We've had a total of 4 elections in this country, and 2 of them have gone wrong. So they created the modern electoral college system with the 12th Amendment. And the 12th Amendment said that each elector would vote for a president and for a vice president, and it would be a separate tally for who won the presidency versus who won the vice presidency. Now, the difference was, it used to be that if you were the second most popular person in the country, you became the vice president. Now the vice president became somebody who was kind of just a follower of the president, or somebody that the president needed to help his ticket win the election. Now, the executive branch does give certain powers directly to the president, and this is an important slide because it lists 5 powers of the president. This is not the way the book conceptualizes it. The book conceptualizes the power of the president being divided between his powers as head of state and his powers as head of government. However, you can also look at the powers of the president in terms of them being divided into 5 different areas. The president's power as commander-in-chief, which we will call his military power. His diplomatic power, which is his power to send and receive ambassadors. His legislative powers, which is to say his power of setting the legislative agenda, his lawmaking powers. Now, he sets the agenda through his State of the Union address, but he also sets the agenda through his veto power. Remember, if the president vetoes a bill, it takes a 2/3 vote of the House and a 2/3 vote of the Senate to override that veto. Now, that makes overriding a veto as hard as it is to propose a constitutional amendment. So as you could imagine, there's not going to be a great many veto overrides. It's much easier for Congress to just try to pass a law that the president is likely to support. And so that makes the president a player in negotiations with Congress in order to implement a law that they would like. The president has executive powers, which is to say his power to oversee the executive branch. We talk about executive orders, we talk about executive privilege. When we talk about the president, we're going to see how he is able to enforce his power over the executive branch. But in essence, he's the leader of the executive branch, and therefore he has certain powers to administrate the U.S. government. And then finally, he has certain judicial powers. The most obvious of these is his power to pardon, which means he can forgive anybody who's convicted under federal law of violating the law. And then they are released from prison or released from custody. They could be on probation or something. And he makes judicial appointments. So all of the members of the judiciary are nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and then appointed by the president. When we look at Marbury versus Madison, we're going to see that the nomination itself, followed by the confirmation itself, doesn't automatically make somebody a judge. They have to receive their judicial commission, which is to say their appointment from the president, before they take office. So the president has a great deal of authority over the judicial branch. Each of these are meaningfully separate, right? He has power over each of the three branches of government. He has power in international affairs. His military power and his diplomatic power are usually those powers that the book would refer to as his powers as head of state. Article 3 establishes the courts. This is the Supreme Court and the lower federal courts. It defines the types of cases that the courts hear, which is to say federal questions, which are cases under federal law, involve the U.S. government as a party in the case, or involve the U.S. Constitution, or diversity jurisdiction, which is to say that it's not necessarily a case under federal law, but it's a case between people from different states or the different states themselves. The courts are either the chief arbiters of federal law and they're the chief arbiters of relationships between the states. And judicial review, or the idea that the courts can find an act of Congress or the president unconstitutional, is not actually in Article 3, but has been established by precedent, which is to say they've done it and we've accepted it as something that they do. Article 4 touches on the regulation of states and of federal relations with the states. The full faith and credit clause, this is a provision that says that the actions of one state should be recognized by other states, such as marriage, such as driver's licenses. This isn't universal, but it's an important aspect of allowing a citizen of one state to go through and to live their life in another state. I, for instance, was married in Michigan, but I don't have a new Georgia marriage certificate. The Privileges and Immunities Clause suggests that each state is responsible for treating a resident of another state as though, when that person is in their state, as though they were a resident of their own state. So this doesn't do you an awful lot of good if you have a certain right in one state that another state doesn't recognize. However, if, for instance, the state of North Carolina was evacuating somebody due to a hurricane, they can't say, well, we're going to evacuate North Carolina residents and then have Georgia residents have to stay. The Fugitive Slave Clause, which is very important to the South, said that that it was the responsibility of the federal government to return slaves who had escaped to their owners. Article 4 allowed the creation of new states, guaranteed each state a republican form of government. You can't have a monarchy of New Mexico. And a protection from invasion. Interestingly, some states along the southern border of the United States have made arguments in the past that immigration was a form of foreign invasion. And the courts have always said that it's up to the U.S. government to determine what is meant by foreign invasion. And so the state's ability to enforce this is quite limited. Article 5 deals with constitutional amendments. This is a two-step process, which actually makes it quite difficult. There's only been 27 constitutional amendments in American history. On the national level, amendments are proposed. The only way this has ever actually been done in practice in the United States is that Congress, by a 2/3 vote of the House and a 2/3 vote of the Senate, will propose a resolution that will propose, they will pass a resolution that will propose a constitutional amendment with its specific language. And then it gets sent to the states for ratification. Now, as we know, the national government and the state government are elected separately. So sometimes it's a very different terrain on the state level than what you find on the national level. And the ratification process is even more difficult because it takes 3/4 of the states to ratify a constitutional amendment. And this has been done two different ways. Now, state legislatures can, by a majority vote of both chambers of the state legislature, approve or ratify a constitutional amendment. And then 3/4, though, as you note, is a lot of states. What is 13 states can block a constitutional amendment, and we see that with certain constitutional amendments, like the Equal Rights Amendment. The main reason why that fell apart was because when the national government, when the Congress proposed the Equal Rights Amendment, they set a deadline in the resolution on how long they had to approve the constitutional amendment. And when that deadline passed, the ratifications of the states that had already proposed it expired, but so too did the proposal itself. Now, sometimes the state legislatures don't have enough support. There was one time that Congress proposed a constitutional amendment and instead set up state ratifying conventions in order to ratify the amendment. And this was because this was for the repeal of prohibition. And the main reason why they did this was because even though a huge majority of the people opposed prohibition and wanted prohibition to be overturned, the people who were in favor of prohibition were in both political parties. And the Democrats who were running the country at the time did not want to split the Democratic Party. And since they figured that they could get some Republicans to vote to end prohibition, along with most Democrats, they felt they had a much better chance to have ratifying conventions overturn prohibition, which is what happened. We could also have, on the national level, to propose a constitutional amendment, we could have a constitutional convention. And if 2/3 of the states propose a constitutional convention, Congress can call for one, but that's never happened as yet. Article 6 deals with national supremacy. It says the U.S. government is the supreme law of the land when acting according to the Constitution. It also prescribes oaths for government officials. As a practical matter, saying that the U.S. government is supreme is really critical, but there's not a lot going on in this article of the Constitution. And then Article 7 dealt with the ratification of the Constitution, something that wasn't seen as an automatic at the time, and in fact, it was necessary for the people who proposed the Constitution to agree to have a Bill of Rights in order for the Constitution to be adopted. And even so, in states such as New York, it was very, very close on whether the Constitution would pass. And in fact, Rhode Island never ratified the Constitution until after the U.S. government had started. And Rhode Island was faced with being one small country on its own. And when the first Congress proposed the Bill of Rights, they quickly decided to sign on. And we will talk about the Bill of Rights more. With the first 10 amendments to the Constitution will pretty much get their own section when we talk about civil rights and civil liberties in chapters 4 and 5. The one thing we might want to say is that the 10th Amendment did reserve all powers that were not specifically assigned to the national government under the Constitution. They assigned it to the states.